Good evening. Hope you're well tonight. My name is Steve Ott. I'm the Dean of the Belk College of Business, and it's great to see so many students and faculty, staff gathered here tonight to learn about the impact analytics has had and will have on politics and business from our speaker, Andrew Claster. This event is part of the Belk College Speaker Series, which we call Next. The Next series was launched several years ago to focus on the ideas, people, and trends that are driving what's next in business. And our goal is to provide our students, our faculty, staff, alumni, and members of the public, and we'll have a public event tomorrow morning at the Westin, with the opportunity to connect and discuss interesting ideas and topics. Today's program focuses on big data, or as we call it at UNC Charlotte, data science and business analytics. That initiative is a key strategic priority for UNC Charlotte and for the Belk College, and it's also a hot topic in the media, as you know. Businesses in a wide variety of industries are clamoring for talent that can help bridge the gap between business strategy, the business of data, with the science of data. Excuse me. In response to these industry needs, UNC Charlotte and the Belk College has offered now a concentration in business analytics at the MBA level. We also have a professional science master's degree in health informatics. That's a degree that is done between the College of Computing and Informatics and the College of Health and Human Services. We've launched a new degree with the Belk College of Business as a partner with the College of Computing and Informatics, a certificate which is in data science and business analytics. And we hope to have in the very near future a professional science master's degree in data science and business analytics. So if you're interested in learning more about those particular programs, just visit the DSBA website. That's dsba.uncc.edu. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Andrew Claster. He served as Deputy Chief Analytics Officer for President Barack Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. In this role, he helped create and lead the Obama Analytics team of more than 50 analysts, statistical modelers, and engineers, and a couple of professional gamblers, I hear. The Obama Analytics team used predictive modeling, data analysis, and technology to revolutionize political polling and individual level target marketing, and they dramatically increased the efficiency of voter contact, fundraising, volunteer recruitment, research, advertising, marketing, and communications, online and offline. Andrew previously developed micro-targeting and communication strategies for a firm, Penn, Schoen Berland, where he was vice president, and he had clients in both business and politics, including Hillary Rodham Clinton, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Verizon, Microsoft, BP, KPMG, and the Washington Nationals baseball team. Andrew completed his undergraduate studies in political science at Yale University, and he had his graduate training in economics from the London School of Economics. With that, Andrew, welcome to Charlotte, and UNC Charlotte, welcome to Next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve and Sasha and the rest of the Belk team. It's great being here. I want to give you a little bit of insight into the Obama Analytics operation and talk more broadly as well about analytics. First, I want to ask a couple questions. How many people in this room voted in the last election? Great. How many people in the room were eligible to vote but were unable to vote in the last election for whatever reason? Okay. Slightly more honest than the undergraduates we were talking to earlier today. So a couple of the things that we're trying to do and that we've been trying to do as a campaign analytics operation are first figure out who's going to vote, who isn't going to vote. What's the probability that each individual is going to turn out and cast a vote on election day? And then from there, we want to find out who are the people we can influence. Who are the people for whom we can increase the probability that they are going to turn out and vote? One of the other big things that we try to do is assess support. If they vote, who's going to vote for us and who's going to vote for our opponent? And then who are the individuals who we can influence in that way? So I want you to think about those, keep those two questions in mind. Everything else that we're trying to do when we're trying to register people to vote, when we're trying to recruit volunteers, when we're trying to raise money, ultimately we're trying to get the people who support us to turn out and vote, and we're trying to get the people who are going to vote to support us. So here is a picture from the cave. The cave is where we sat. The analytics team, this team of 50 analysts, engineers, and modelers, we sat in a single room with no windows, elbow to elbow. There are a bunch of people who are not at their seats in that particular picture, but when everyone is there, we're quite literally elbow to elbow. Each person had about 20 to 30 inches of desk space in the cave. So we were locked away in this room with no windows for two reasons. And the first reason was that we wanted to be isolated from reporters. So when press come into the office and they want to talk to the communications folks and they want to have TV cameras showing staffers and volunteers working away, we wanted to make sure that our material, the internal polling, the maps showing where we were spending our resources, were away from that public view. The other reason we wanted to be in a room together was for communication within the team. We wanted to create a safe space where analysts could say what was on their mind without fear that they were going to redirect accidentally a bunch of resources within the campaign. So if somebody says, "Oh, this poll shows us losing in Ohio," we don't want the entire campaign to flip out. We want to have the time and the space to dig into those numbers, find out what's going on. Is there a sampling issue? Has there been a real movement? What does that movement mean? How big is that movement? So by facilitating that kind of communication and learning from each other, about a third of our team had previous political experience, but 2/3 didn't. And so we wanted to make sure that the folks who were building models who had never worked in politics before were learning from the people who had worked in politics before, and the people who hadn't done particular types of statistical modeling were learning from those who had, for example. So this particular picture was taken between 4:30 and 4:45 one afternoon. I know that because at 4:30 on every day, we would turn out the lights and turn on the laser lights and play a beat that one of our DJ / modeling analysts had created. So when you've got 50 people sitting in quarters that tight, working 80 hours a week, there are things you have to do to make things interesting and fun. So first of all, what is analytics? A lot of times when people talk about analytics, they talk about big data or they talk about data mining. I look at that as a very bottom-up approach. You know, what data do we have and how can we use it? I like to start at the top, thinking strategically, thinking, what are we trying to do? What are our goals? And then how can we use data to support that? So for me, that process is, number one, define the goals. What are we trying to do? As a company, are we trying to maximize revenue? Are we trying to maximize profit? Are we trying to introduce a new product, maximize sales? Are we trying to reduce costs? Then second, what are the things we can affect to reach those goals? What do we have control over? We have control over the advertising budget. We have control on a campaign over our volunteers, where we locate field offices, who we target for voter registration. And then finally, how can we use data analysis to accomplish this? So how can we use the data we have? What tests can we run? What experiments can we run? What data can we analyze to come up with an answer and translate everything into cost per vote in the election context? So a lot of this field is a very recent development. Until a decade or so ago, there were basically three options that could be used together for targeting. One was precinct level targeting. You can find out for every state, every county in the country, you can download or call up the County Board of Elections or the Secretary of State and ask for the records or look on their website and find the records of every election from the past however many years and the results of those elections at the precinct level. So for each precinct or polling place, how many people voted for the Democrat, how many people voted for the Republican, how many people voted for each other or independent candidate in each precinct. And so as a Democratic campaign, in the past you could say, okay, we need really high turnout in the Democratic precincts, so we're going to send all our volunteers to the precincts that are 80% plus Democratic or 60% plus Democratic, and we're going to try and turn everybody out to vote. But there are a lot of people in those precincts who are not necessarily going to vote for our candidate, and there are some people in other precincts who will support our candidate. So one of the other options is individual voter targeting. And the way this used to be done was you would get a copy of the voter list, and there's an example on the right. The earliest example I know of someone using a computer to do this rather than doing it manually was in the 1968 presidential campaign when George Romney's campaign acquired the voter file for New Hampshire, for the New Hampshire presidential primary, and used that data to target voters at the individual level. So you can get this list in every state from the Secretary of State or County Board of Elections, and it will tell you in every state the name of each registered voter, their address, the precinct in which they're registered to vote. In most states, you can get their date of birth, or at least their year of birth. You get their gender. In some states, you can get their ethnicity. In states with party registration, you can find out if they're a registered Democrat or Republican. And so for that kind of individual level targeting, people would say, well, we're going to contact all the registered Democrats and try and get them out to vote. And then the third is demographic targeting. You can say, well, we know that we have very strong support among independent women and all Democrats, but Republican women are a swing group or a persuasion target for us. And so you can do that sort of demographic targeting where you're combining the individual level data with some other information you have, polling, for example. And you can bring in other demographic data as well, census data. So what percentage of the people in this particular community are of this ethnicity, or what percentage of people are of this income, or what's the average income in this area, what's the average home price in this area, and use that information for that kind of targeting. So we can say, okay, we think our supporters tend to be middle to low income in these types of precincts, et cetera. Now, what we tried to do was combine all of that information to build individual level models to predict at the individual level who's going to turn out, who's going to support us, using all the demographic information, all the precinct level information, and all the individual level information. And I'll talk more a little later about all the data that we had access to and how we used it. So a little bit more on the history. In 2000 and 2004, the map looked very similar. There were, Bush won both of those elections. He won almost all of the same states. The only states that flipped from 2000 to 2004 were New Mexico, Iowa, and New Hampshire. And at the end of the 2004 campaign, the sense Democrats had was that the Republicans and the Bush campaign had outperformed us in part using data and analytics, that they did a better job of micro-targeting. They did a better job, a more efficient job of identifying who those voters were and getting them out to vote using one-to-one voter contact. So we made the decision after the 2004 campaign that Democrats were going to invest in data and analytics. And so there were a couple different projects. There's an organization called Catalyst, which decided to acquire all these voter files, and they work only for Democratic and progressive candidates, causes, and campaigns. They're based in Washington, D.C. The Democratic National Committee, you see up on the right, decided to acquire its own voter file and build a national voter file. There are also a couple organizations over at Yale. There's a group called the Institute for Social and Policy Studies that does work with both Democratic and Republican campaigns and causes. And what they focus on is field experiments, figuring out what works and what doesn't. Randomized, controlled experiments where you contact some voters and then you have a control group that doesn't get contacted, and then you measure the impact, either through polling, if you're trying to measure support, or turnout. You look at actual voter records to see who turned out on election day and who didn't. And then you can, again, measure a cost per vote. So if we send out this piece of mail to these people, how many votes will we get? How much did it cost us? And you can do that with online ads. You can do that with TV ads. You can do that with volunteer contact. And then the Analyst Institute is a group that does that also sponsors and conducts experiments, but only for Democratic and progressive groups. So the things that came together were the data. There was more data available than ever before. Computing power became more available and much less expensive. Modeling science advanced tremendously. And this new field of randomized controlled experiments used in politics. So in 2008 and in 2012, we saw a very different map. Again, these two maps are a lot alike. The only states that, that flipped were Indiana and North Carolina. North Carolina went from going for Obama by a fraction of a point in 2008 to us losing by around 2 percentage points in 2012. So it was still a very close state, but shifted against us. And you see, at the end of the 2012 campaign, the sense was that the Democrats had done a much better job with data and analytics than the Republicans. So one area which is very visible to people, a lot of what we do is hidden away and people can't see. It's very hard for outsiders to measure how good one campaign's targeting is compared to another. But one thing you can see is who accurately predicted which states were going to vote for candidate A or candidate B. And so at the top, you see a list of 4 Republican commentators, pundits on TV, who had access to the Romney campaign's internal data. And all of them predicted that Mitt Romney was going to win. And in most cases, by a large margin. So until the last couple weeks of the election, it wasn't clear to us whether they were just spinning and trying to make things look better than they were, or if they really believed that. And what we found out in the last couple weeks, especially on election night, was that in fact, their information was so bad that they did believe that Mitt Romney was going to win that election. And the Romney campaign believed they were going to win that election. But there was a lot of public information available that made it clear that that wasn't going to happen. There's a guy over at the New York Times named Nate Silver who writes a blog called 538. And he built a very accurate predictive model based just on the public polls, based on information that is available to anyone and everyone to predict who was going to win the election. And he called every state exactly right. We had a model that was very similar to Nate Silver's, an internal model, that had very similar predictions. Our model turned out to be slightly more accurate than Nate Silver's by a fraction of a point. Another place that, for publicly available data is InTrade. This is a place where individuals can place bets on who they think is going to win the election. And again, when people put their money where their mouth was, when people put money on the line, they were able to accurately predict via crowdsourcing, essentially, who was going to win each state and the overall election. So on the left, you see Nate Silver's model, and the gradations that you see are an indication of the way we view the world, which is probabilistically. People often ask me, when did you know that Barack Obama was going to win the election? And the answer is, there is no time during the 4 or 5 years prior to Election Day, 4 years prior to Election Day, when my expectation of victory was below 50%. But it changed. You know, there were times when it was very close to 50%, when it was around 55% or 56%. And then there were times when it was closer to 90%. So I can't really answer the question, when did you know? Because for me, it's not binary. It's probabilistic. And if you look at Nate Silver's model, which again tracked our model very closely, when he first released his model in the late spring or early summer of 2012, he had Barack Obama's expected probability of winning over 50%. It never dipped below 50%. And then by Election Day, it was close to 90%. And that was very close to our model. And then on the right, you see the actual election results, which again, map exactly to what was predicted by our model and by Silver's model. So 2 questions. Why did they get it so wrong? And does it matter? And if so, why does it matter? First of all, a lot of their assumptions were flawed. So they made an assumption that enthusiasm among Democratic voters and key Democratic constituencies was lower in 2012 than in 2008. But they never tested that assumption against the data. There were lots of indicators available publicly and internally to their campaign as well as to ours that should have indicated to them that their model of the electorate was not correct. One is voter registration. We looked at who was registering to vote. 2 was volunteers, who was turning out to volunteer. 3 was the IDs, the data that our volunteers were coming back with about support. 4 was the internal polling. 5 was the early vote data. Once people started actually casting ballots, requesting mail ballots, returning ballots, we looked at that. And you know, the other side had explanations for all of this. They said, well, the Obama campaign is registering a lot of people to vote, but those people aren't actually going to turn out to vote. Or they would say, well, the Obama campaign is getting lots of people to request absentee ballots, but those people will never return those ballots. Or they would say, well, the Obama campaign is getting lots of people to vote early, but they're just cannibalizing their election day vote. None of those people are going to turn out on election day. But they weren't doing the right analysis to test those assumptions and to test the robustness of those assumptions. So if you make slightly different assumptions, or if you make substantially different assumptions, what happens? And so a lot of what we did was testing out dozens and hundreds and thousands of scenarios to say, okay, what if we're wrong about this? What if registration is 10% lower among this group than we anticipate? What does that mean for us on election day? What can we do to make those votes up? Once we've figured out the cost per vote through registration, persuasion, turnout, you know, we can say if we're not hitting our goals here, here are the ways we might be able to make it up. And on a state-by-state basis, you know, here's what that means. And so the second question, why does it matter? You know, why does it matter if you know which states you're winning or losing? Well, one important reason is resource allocation, because we can move tens of millions of dollars, volunteers, staff, from one state to another. We can decide to increase our investment in a state like Ohio, if we think that that's going to be the critical state that's going to get us to 270 electoral votes, which is the number we need to win. We can increase our investment in Virginia. We can pull back our investment in a state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania if we think we're doing very well there. We can pull back our investment in a state like North Carolina if we think that we're doing less well than we anticipate there, and we think that that state is unlikely to be the one that gets us to 270 electoral votes. So having accurate, real-time information updated daily on which states we're winning and losing and by how much is very valuable from the campaign's perspective. And that's just one example. So I want to give you a little bit of insight into the cave itself and what life was like there. So I talked about how targeting used to be done, precinct, individual level, et cetera. Then this movement towards micro-targeting. In 2008, the Obama targeting team was made up of just 4 to 6 individuals. In 2010, we increased that up to 15 to 18 people, full-time staff. And then in 2012, we expanded that tremendously to more than 50 people. And we had an internal analytics technology team, for example. We had an internal experiments team whose job was just to conduct these randomized controlled experiments, analyze the results, come up with ideas for experiments. We had a modeling team. We had a digital team that focused on what we were doing on email, on the website, barackobama.com. There was also a team that focused on online advertising. We had a finance and fundraising team, in addition to focusing on volunteer recruitment, staff recruitment, where to place staff, where to place offices, where to focus our voter registration efforts, on whom to focus our persuasion and turnout efforts. So we had a lot of rules inside the cave. And the first one was, when it comes to prioritizing projects, always need to be thinking about the overarching goal. The overarching goal is the re-election of the president. How do we do that? 270 electoral votes. How do we get 270 electoral votes? Well, in a close election, there's a set of states that we're going to win. There's a set of states that we're going to lose. And then there's a set of battleground states that we could win or we could lose. So we need to focus all of our resources on those states and identify which are the states that are key, and then who are the individual voters within those states. So every project we work on, you need to think about, how does that get us to 270 electoral votes? And if you can figure out how much time that project is going to take you and what the range of votes you expect is going to be. So let's say if I build this model, I think it's going to improve the efficiency of our targeting by 10%. You can translate that into the number of votes that you think that's going to get you and compare that to another project and figure out, okay, this project needs to be prioritized ahead of this project. Test everything. We want people to be able to challenge whatever the received wisdom is. We want to provide a safe space for people to speak up. We required that recommendations and decisions must be based in data and analysis. So, people couldn't just talk off the cuff without any data to back it up. We wanted to make sure that there are things we don't know the answer to, and we shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge that. And then finally, if there's something we don't know the answer to, what we want people to do is come up with an idea for how to find that answer. Come up with a test, come up with an experiment, design that experiment, conduct that experiment, get buy-in from the people who need to be involved in that experiment, do the analysis, and then present the result. Critical elements for us: number one, mandate from above. The campaign manager, Jim Messina, when he launched the campaign in April of 2011, he did so with an online video in which he said, on this campaign, we're going to measure everything we do. If something is working, we want to do more of it. And if it's not working, we want to fix it or do something different. So there was buy-in from the very top of the campaign, direction from the top of the campaign, that this was the way we were going to do it. We were going to use data and analytics to answer questions. 2, we positioned ourselves as consultants. So rather than trying to impose mandates across the organization or being seen as subservient to one part of the organization. We wanted to be a source of research and data and information and analysis that could be used by every group within the campaign. So we service the communications team. We service the TV advertising team, the polling team, the field team, the fundraising team. So when people wanted to know, I need to recruit 10,000 more volunteers in Iowa. Should I go after this group of people or that group of people? We were able to do the analysis, potentially come up with a test or an experiment, and come up with an answer for them. If the communications folks wanted to know, or the scheduling folks wanted to know, we've got the president for 3 days. What media markets should we send him into? Or if the advertising team said, we've got these 4 ads that we want to test. Which ones perform the best, and who should they be shown to, and in what markets should they be shown? Outreach. Our internal sales strategy was we want to go to each of these departments, each of these individuals, and find out from them what their needs are. What are the questions that they're trying to answer? What are the questions they don't have the answer to? And then figure out what we can provide them that would be helpful. Is there a tool? Is there a spreadsheet? Do they want a simulator where they can play with the numbers, adjust the numbers, and figure out, okay, we're going to put these resources in here and see how many votes that gets me? Do they want maps? So we're constantly trying. Do they need a report to evaluate how their team is performing so they can identify who's underperforming and who's overperforming? So that was, our approach was to build customized products for each of these folks. And then internal and external validation, constantly going back to them asking, how is this working? Does this report make sense to you? Are you getting the kinds of results that we forecast in our model? Using whatever data is available, thinking about all the internal and external data that is available to us, all that registration data, the early vote data, the absentee ballot requests, the public polling, the internal polling, the volunteer voter IDs. This is a picture of our team. So just to give you an idea of some of the backgrounds, we had one guy there who was an MBA. He was also a former naval officer. We had, it's a relatively young team. We had 3 or 4 people who hadn't finished college yet. We had, let's see, we had a couple scientists, one a stem cell researcher, and another was a particle physicist. And when we're building a team, what we're looking to do is we're trying to build a team of people with a lot of varied skills. So we wanted some people who had political experience, some people who didn't. Some people who knew big data, some people who were specialists in modeling, some people who were good with data visualization, some people who knew media data. So we had, for example, a former producer from Bill O'Reilly's show over on Fox News. We had a couple consultants from places like Accenture and McKinsey working for us. Those guys are very good at PowerPoint. So if you are trying to explain technical material to non-technical audiences, which is what we're trying to do, those guys are great. We had, let's see, a lot of former consultants, political consultancy, economic consultancy, a lot of folks who had done programs in quantitative methods in social sciences, either undergraduate or master's programs. A few folks who were working on their PhDs. As Steve mentioned, 3 former professional gamblers. One of my favorite stories from the campaign is about one of those professional gamblers, former gamblers, a guy named Scott Safranek. Scott went to Columbia twice and decided the first time he went as a pure math major, The second time he went as a philosophy major, and both times decided college wasn't for him. So he moved to Vegas and started gambling. He said he had just gotten his mom accustomed to the idea that he could make a living playing poker when he told her that he was quitting poker to be a field organizer for Barack Obama in the 2008 Nevada caucus. This was in 2007. And that as a field organizer, he was going to be earning, I don't know, $25,000 a year, something like that. So Scott's mother made him promise that he would go to the casino at least one day a week so that he could pay his rent. So working in analytics, whether it's politics or business, the kinds of backgrounds that are useful, number one, statistics or any quant field. I'm sure that as part of the MBA, you guys have some stats, accounting, finance, et cetera. And I'm sure there are folks who have studied engineering and other sciences as well. Building predictive models is great experience. Programming. And as I said, a lot of the folks on our team were quite young. They were undergrads. So these were people who, had just tooled around with programming in their spare time, or in many cases, or folks who were just really good analysts. They're really good at looking at data and visualizing patterns and making sense of what it means. And as I mentioned before, communication is extremely important to us. There are lots of people who can build really good models, but if we can't explain what these models do and what their value is to our clients, to the people who are actually going to implement our recommendations, then we haven't done our job. Because all the work we've done is for naught because it's not going to be implemented. Mapping and data visualization, experience with data of all kinds. There's tremendous demand right now for people who know online data, social media data, people who can analyze clicks, whatever it might be. Certainly in our field, people who have experience with politics, whether it's with the data side of politics or any other part of politics. And finally, as I mentioned, communication. So here's a little insight into our particular data and how we use it. On the left, we get the voter file data I mentioned earlier, what we call field IDs, which is the data that comes from volunteers about who people support, the polling IDs that comes from our pollsters, all the online data we collect, all the offline data we collect, volunteers and what we call actions that people take, so attending events, for example. Commercial data. There are a lot of commercial vendors out there that sell data on what magazines people subscribe to. They have their own proprietary models that predict what their income is likely to be or who's likely to be a parent or have young kids at home, that sort of thing. And then finally, all of our donations, so the online and offline donations. We match all that data. It comes to us in several different formats. We process, we clean that data. Then we store that data in a couple different formats. We have one that's available to us as a back end for modeling, and then another more limited data set is available to our staff in the field. And then those are the things that we develop with that. We create maps, we build reports, simulators, we help people generate lists to figure out who they should be targeting, et cetera. And these are the various ways in which we used it. We used it for voter contact. When I talked earlier about first defining what your goal is and then figuring out what are the things you can do as a campaign or as an organization to affect that goal, ultimately we're looking at voter contact. The four things we can do are we can register people to vote, we can persuade them to support our candidate, we can turn them out, and we can protect their vote at the polls on election day. We can make sure that their vote gets counted. Those are the four things we can do. And everything else we do is designed to support that. The fundraising, the volunteer recruitment, building our online presence, All of those things, our entire communications strategy, our press strategy, all of that is designed to do those 4 things. Register people to vote, persuade them to support our candidate, turn them out, and protect their vote at the polls on election day. So we focus on volunteer recruitment. We focus on getting people to vote early. We do lots and lots of polling. We build lots of reports, visualization, and mapping. We conduct lots of experiments. We focus on fundraising. How can we increase donors and donations online and offline? How do we get people to take actions online? How do we get people to sign up online and say that they're willing to volunteer? How do we get them to show up to an event? Optimizing our TV advertising buy, making sure that we're sending the right message to the right people in the right medium at the right time. Scheduling events and media appearances. Where do we want to send the president? Where do we want to send the vice president or the first lady to do an event? Communications, which are the media that are most important for us to focus on. And finally, developing and evaluating technology tools. So finally, I want to talk about some business applications, and then I want to open up to questions. So some things we learned are, number 1, as mentioned at the beginning, first thing to do is to define goals and priorities, and then align data and analytics with those goals and priorities. Want to make sure that we're testing everything that we don't already know. Randomized controlled experiments are the best way to do that. They're the gold standard. Measuring results using actual market outcomes. So if we're trying to drive sales, I want my dependent variable to be how many units did we sell. If we're trying to increase our profit, I want my dependent variable to be what's our profit. And try to avoid, where possible, intermediate outcomes such as company favorability or, in market research, stated intent to purchase, where there is actual real market data available. And then finally, individual level modeling. We always want to go to the most granular level possible. And every firm can do this. There are a lot of companies out there, Axiom, Experian, that have individual level data. A lot of companies have their own proprietary individual level data, customer data, internal, external sales data. And so if you can combine these data sets, you can build some very powerful models. And then whatever's done at the individual level can always be rolled up to a greater geography. So if you've identified who the individuals are who you want to target, you can then roll that up to a media market, for example, for a television advertising buy. You can roll that up to another geography if you're trying to figure out where you want to locate your stores, for example. And here's a list of some of the tools we use. So first, strategy development is just thinking about what it is we're trying to do and how do we do it. Auditing data, very important, figuring out what data do we have inside the organization, what data is out there that's available, and how good is that data, how populated are those data sets, how accurate are they. Testing, so before acquiring a data set, we want to figure out how much is this going to help us, how much lift is this going to provide us, how many unit sales is this going to lead to. And so most data companies will give you sample data for testing, so you can figure out, you can calculate exactly what kind of lift you're going to get from that additional data. Data integration, we had our data in several different platforms. So back in 2008, we had our voter file. We had our volunteer data, which was matched to some degree. We had our online data as well, which was not being matched in any automated fashion. And so we sort of developed a bunch of hack solutions to match this data. And a lot of companies are in a similar situation. They have their sales data in one place, their CRM data in another place. Their online data is not in the same place as their offline data. They're in different databases. different hardware, different software, and the data belongs, those data sets belong to different departments and divisions within the organization. And there isn't always the proper direction from above or the right incentives within the organization to share that data and to use it for, number one, to realize the overall goals of the organization. Testing, advertising, sales, and marketing. Again, figuring out what message or what offer or what product to market to whom and in what channel. Again, building individual level predictive models, segmentation, micro-targeting, conducting randomized controlled experiments, driving online, offline action, making sure that you're not cannibalizing the work of your colleagues, moving people from a less expensive customer acquisition channel to a more expensive customer acquisition channel. And using the information from each to inform the other so that you know when you're targeting someone online, everything about them, how much they've purchased online and offline. Reporting and visualization, very useful for senior management and leadership within the organization. Building simulators, there are in many companies folks who love sitting there with an Excel sheet and playing with, well, what if I drop the price on this by this much? Or what if I offer this special incentive? What's that going to do to my sales? What's that going to do to my profit and revenue? And that can help them identify particular packages they want to offer or particular price points that they want to offer. But it can also give them a broader view of the marketplace. It can tell them, again, how robust certain products or certain offers are to small changes. So you can say, okay, well, I can play with this as much as I want, but it's not actually going to have much influence on my number of unit sales. But if I change this, then that will have a major impact. And then finally, technology platforms and tools. What are some of the tools we can develop and give people that help them do analysis and help provide them with insight into their organization and help them make better decisions? I think that's it. So I want to open up and take some questions. Yes, go ahead. Uh-huh. Hmm? Yes. Yep. Yep. Right. Sure. Sure. Yeah. So the guy who built our predictive model for figuring out which state, what the margin was in each state at the state level, the model that was similar to Nate Silver's model, was a Bayesian mathematician, and so that was the approach that he used. And then regarding the experiments, we didn't actually put voters in cages and feed them cookies, but that sounds like something worth testing for 2016. Yes.
So, success at the president.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
the average senator
Hmm?
house seats
Right.
$1 million. What is that?
Absolutely.
Like, say I want to go run for a house seat.
Right.
Does that mean then that I have to be?
Right.
What am I?
That's a great question. There are a few things, a few points there. So one is that all of the data we collected, all of the analysis that we collected, and all of the models we built and all of the technology tools that we built are now the property of the Democratic National Committee and the successor Obama organization, and those are shared with Democratic candidates and campaigns. So Democratic candidates and campaigns at every level, House, Senate, governor, state legislature, have access to a lot of the resources that we developed and used during the campaign. Also, the second point is that what we're trying to do with data and analytics is make the resource allocation more efficient. So if a campaign is spending millions of dollars on TV advertising, we want to be able to take 10 to 20% of that ad budget and use that for testing so that we make sure that we're using that advertising as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And then finally, I would say that not only the actual data and technology tools that we learned, that we collected for the presidential campaign are now available to other campaigns down ballot, but the lessons we learned, a lot of that information is also available and is being shared with campaigns down ballot, so that you don't necessarily have to test everything every single time. There's always a question about how generalizable is this finding. You know, did this work only in a presidential campaign, or can it also work in a Senate campaign or a gubernatorial campaign or a campaign for a ballot initiative? So some of these things do need to be retested. But in the absence of budget for retesting, when there's no other information, people will often implement the conclusions from an experiment conducted in a previous campaign. Right. Sure. There are lots of things. So the first Friday of every month, I always wanted to know what the employment and unemployment numbers were going to be. That's when those numbers get reported by the federal government. So that had a major impact on my understanding. And by late spring, early summer, I felt pretty good about the state of the recovery and where we were. But that was always, you know, a question mark. Are we headed into another recession? And so that was one outside variable. The first presidential debate, the president didn't perform particularly well. And so the question for us was, what impact did that have? We thought at the end of that debate that we had probably taken a hit in the polls. I think going into that debate, my expectation was we were going to be perceived as the loser of that debate, regardless, because the president, debates like primaries are all about expectations. It's not about who wins or loses. It's about who does better or worse relative to expectations. So for that debate, you know, the conventional wisdom about Barack Obama was he's really popular, he's a great communicator. Mitt Romney is really bad at communicating. He's not sympathetic. He's not very good at understanding people. And so the expectation going into that was that Obama was going to outperform Romney, and so my expectation was that we were going to perform worse than that. In reality, the president did underperform that night, and I listened to most of the debate on radio, and as in 1960, there was the discussion of the Kennedy-Nixon debate, where folks who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon had won, while folks who watched on TV thought that Kennedy had won. In that debate, I thought the president sounded better on the radio than he apparently looked on TV. But regardless, we took a hit that night. And so our job as the analytics team was to calculate how big is that hit, what does that mean for us? Are there states that where we felt pretty good, like Pennsylvania and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, that were now competitive? Were there states where we had been playing, like Florida North Carolina that we should take off the board, or was this a hit that, that was survivable? And the other question was the trajectory. Is this a change in level, and then where, are we staying at that level, or is that the start of a continued slide? And so, so our evaluation showed that, that cost us, I believe the number we came up with was about 1.5 points. But heading into that debate, we were in a very strong position. After the Republican convention and the Democratic convention, after Mitt Romney's 47% comment, we were in a very strong position relative to how we'd done over the 6 or 9 months leading up to Election Day. And so, so that 1.5 points looked, or whatever it was, something like that, looked very survivable. And from the trajectory standpoint, it looked like we had taken a hit in level, but that we were not seeing continued deterioration. I think if we had bombed the second debate, it might have, then we would have seen something different. I never had the opportunity to ask the president this question, but I always wondered if he threw the first debate on purpose just to make sure that we continued working hard. Yes. We were thinking per individual vote. So because we look at it on the at each state. So we prioritize overall based on electoral votes, but we never looked at national numbers, and we rarely looked at our numbers across all battleground states. Almost everything that we looked at when we were producing polling, for example, everything we looked at was on a state-by-state basis. So we would prioritize, for example, Ohio based on where it sat and how many electoral votes it had. We would prioritize Virginia accordingly. We would prioritize Pennsylvania accordingly. And then when we were having a conversation, we were discussing that particular state in the context of the number of electoral votes it had and where that, and how likely that state was to put us over 270. So when we were having that conversation, we were already within the universe of, we're talking about this state and this is how important it is. So at that point, then that's when we start thinking about the individual level. I think we would have used the same approach. I think that regardless of how close the election was, we were going to focus first at the state level, and then within each state at the individual level. Yep. I'm sorry, what was that? A lot of our dependent variables, what? Correct. 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 So, sure. So the question was, a lot of our, was about model validation. A lot of our dependent variables are from the future, like who is someone going to vote for? And in fact, because ballots are secret, we never know the answer to that. Even in the future, we don't know at the individual level who someone voted for. We know at the precinct level. So the way we would validate that, for example, was number one with polling. So we call people up and ask them, who do you support? Which candidate do you support in this election? And then we look at other variables that are correlated or are proxies. So we can look at early voting. We can call up people who have already voted and ask them, which candidate did you vote for? And compare that to what our model predicted, for instance. Sorry, I called on you as well, so I'll take this one last question. How does what play? Yeah, absolutely. So, so our opponents absolutely have their own analytics and data operation. Our sense is that in 2012 and in 2008, we were well ahead of them. They're actively engaged right now in trying to catch up. I think that because they're in a different place on the learning curve than we are, they will significantly narrow the gap. I think in 2016, there are some things that they're going to do better than us. There are some things that we're going to continue to do better than they will. When we're doing our day-to-day, we're trying to focus on what we do, but there are also clues available to us about what they're doing. We can look at their TV advertising buy. We can look at the total voter registration numbers and see what it looks like they're doing. We can look at the things that they report, the things they're signaling to the media about how many volunteers they have, which may or may not be true. We don't know, but we know what they're saying. And so we can get a sense of what they're doing as well. But for the most part, in this case, we were focused primarily on running our campaign. As they catch up and as they start to target, for instance, the same persuadable voters that we're targeting, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think we're going to be looking at the people they're targeting and taking more of a game theoretic approach, where we start thinking more about, if we take this action, what are they going to do, and vice versa. Thank you.